Hello, Alan, and welcome back to my face.
Hello, hello.
How are you today?
I am good. How are you?
I'm excited for doing something unusual and special today.
Yes, I'm very excited to hear what we're going to talk about. I'm super excited for this.
Yeah, I'm trying to get my feet wet with historical discussions and stuff like that with people other
Okay.
than myself.
Hmm.
So,
Okay, so what are we diving into today?
today we're going to do, I don't think we can do a deep dive because I could go on for years and years talking about the topic that we're going to discuss today. But as an introduction to the world of history, but also keeping in line with, India as an idea, I thought we would discuss historical fiction in India. Is it historical or is it hysterical?
Hmm.
So to
That
bring
should be
that,
the title of the video.
I think so too. I think I'm so clever. This idea came to me because, as you know, recently I achieved one of my main life milestones when I published my book.
Yay!
So the book is titled The Lords of India, Imperial Identity from Ajatashatru to Alamgir. It's basically a history of India seen through the eyes of the largest monarchs that existed throughout its history from around the 5th century BCE up until the 18th century. So, what I'm trying to do in the book is to discuss India's entire history of the monarchical system by discussing the biggest players in the playing field at different times of history, and then understanding the cultural differences, the movements, the evolutions, the linguistic traditions, architecture, all of that around these prominent states and how different states around them reacted to that change, right? So
Hmm.
I'm very excited for people to find this book, especially for those who aren't familiar with Indian history, because my target audience is people who are not that familiar with Indian history but want to get into it, but don't know how. So it's basically an introduction. The first volume that I just published is called The Indosphere because it speaks about the Indian sphere of influence that dominated world politics from around the 5th century BCE up until the 13th century, when
Hmm.
paradigms shifted and a new power emerged on the Indian scene. I
Hmm.
think that, and I have also provided lists of authors and books that people can reference and continue reading so that they can, if they find any particular period, person, region, or
Hmm.
tradition interesting, they can go from there. Like,
Okay.
yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
Um, Not exactly about it is about the book. So I'm a person who usually prefer to read fiction
Mm-hmm.
and rarely non-fiction. But I always like listening to stories about like kings and how that happened or that movement and stuff like that. But I would never put in the effort because I feel that it's very dry most of the time.
Okay.
So is the book slightly different from that? Like, is it less dry and is it more of a storytelling? Because I know you're a storyteller. So did
Yeah.
you write it in such a way as well?
I have attempted to keep it as much of a narrative as I
Hmm.
can, but also dealing with historical facts, right?
Hmm.
Because at the end of the day, the onus for writing this book was the understanding that a lot of people in India and particularly outside don't really know Indian history that well. We're familiar with legends and mythologies and folk tales, but actual historical fact itself is lost in the
Hmm.
shuffle. And recently, in the last 4 or 5 years, we have seen a wave of excellent narrative history being written by fabulous authors like my friend Manu Pillai and Anirudh Kanisetti and William Dalrymple and even Vikram Sampath and all these writers, right? But again, because their books are so huge, a lot of people are intimidated to get into it.
Yeah.
Uh, so my plan is to introduce them to these much better, much bigger writers by writing a more simplified, more economical, but yet engaging story of the evolution of the imperial identity in India. I would say I have told stories, but keeping them grounded in historical fact as well as providing information that might spark the fire that will ignite the thirst for history. That's my hope, anyway. I hope I have accomplished it. You
Yeah.
can buy the book and you'll find out.
Yes, I will.
So, the reason I also wanted to do this, the video podcast webinar hybrid situation, is that there are a lot of people out there who would rather watch videos or listen to conversations about history because it's
Mm,
more accessible as well. So
true.
that's another reason why I think this is a great way to engage with people.
Mm,
So again, that leads us to the video, which is historical fiction in India. How historical is it, and how much fiction is there? Like, I'll give
mm.
you an example that I just saw in a TikTok reel. Well, not really TikTok, it's Instagram. I'm not on TikTok. They were talking about the black Taj Mahal made of black marble.
Oh, okay.
And this is a story that we have been told and we have heard several times, that Shah Jahan initially planned to build a black Taj Mahal to mirror the white Taj Mahal that he built on the banks of the Yamuna River,
Oh,
right?
I did not know this. Please do tell.
So if you go to Delhi or Agra or any of these places, the guides will tell you the story that the Taj
Okay.
Mahal that we see is only half the story. And there was supposed to be another Taj Mahal across from the river on the other side, which is now called the Mehtab Bagh, where another Taj Mahal was supposed to be built made out of black marble. But this idea is so popular that people still believe it to be true. But in fact, it's not true. Shah Jahan never planned to build another black Taj Mahal made of marble or anything like that. Because just looking at the plan for the Taj Mahal as it is today, if there had been another equivalent building on the other side of the bank, it would throw off the balance and the symmetry of the whole structure entirely off. But what there could have been, and what definitely was the plan, was an extension of the garden that is in front of the Taj. So if
Mm,
when you go into the Taj, in front of it is a huge Mughal style charbagh garden leading
mm,
to the gateway, right? So that would have been replicated exactly on the other side, and that's what the Mehtab Bagh actually is. The remnants of which have been found today, which is another charbagh style, Persian style, but Indianized garden where people can enjoy and comfortably watch the Taj Mahal from the other direction. So
mm,
that's already one simple story how historical fiction has taken hold over historical fact,
mm,
right? And there are so many other stories with just the Mughals, if you think about it, like Jahanara Begum being the lover of her father Shah Jahan, her having a mysterious child, and all these stories, right? So none of them based on actual historical fact, but based on gossip and what people want to listen to,
mm.
right? These, yeah.
Since we started with Taj, the whole I've heard the story about like after the construction, the hands were
Hmm.
chopped off. It was like a lot of people were murdered, the workers, so that nobody else will create it again, and
Okay.
so on and so forth. How true is it true? How true is it? And like,
Okay.
what is going on there?
I'm glad you brought it up because I had completely forgotten about this particular story. Again, the Taj Mahal was constructed by expert craftsmen. And I forget the name of the architect because I'm not an architecture person, but there is an excellent book by a writer called Ebba Koch. William Dalrymple was talking about this the other day. I was listening to the Empire podcast and they were talking about this. And he did an extensive study of the architectural structures from Mughal India that discusses particularly Humayun and afterwards of their architectural styles. And he talks about this particular myth that Shah Jahan, after the construction of the Taj Mahal, um, chopped off the hands of the architects and murdered the people and all that. The simplest way I can put it is it's utter poppycock because Shah Jahan was somebody who saw himself as the second coming of Alexander. He considered himself to be an
Oh,
extremely special and extremely significant ruler because I think this was like the second millennium or the first millennium of the Islamic calendar. So he saw himself as like a pivotal figure in the history of the Islamic uh, rule and culture.
mm,
Um, and then because he saw himself like that, he always wanted to elevate himself from the hoi polloi of the average ruler. And he conducted himself in that way. When you read about his reign, it's made very apparent by people who did not like him and people who liked him that he was somebody who had extreme self control and who was extremely conscious of the image that was projected. He was a politician in the modern sense of the term. He wasn't just an emperor in the traditional sense. He was extremely conscious of how the imperial family was portrayed, how the dynasty was looked upon, and what legacy they would leave behind. So somebody like that would not go around murdering people who were responsible for the creation of that myth, right?
Mm,
The Taj Mahal was constructed using material from a whole lot of different places, and it required skill levels that can only be honed through generations of knowledge. And he's not going to destroy them, and he didn't. And this is also, again, factually verified by the fact that little notches were marked on the marble during construction to show that I finished this section of the marble, I finished this portion, I'll continue tomorrow. So the artists who worked on it left their marks on it, and they're still there. And it's like a signature. Like when we, like, for example, if somebody does a graffiti, they leave their tag, right? The
mhm,
exact same, sorry, the, uh, the exact same process was followed by these historical architects as well, who left their little notches and marks to make sure that people were made aware to the fact that, hey, I did this.
mhm.
And even more significantly, these same notches that are identified with the Taj are found in other buildings from different parts of the empire later, like years later. So clearly they were not dead.
So he must have had a team of expert craftsmen
Yeah.
who was commissioned to
So the
create over the
Mughals,
years.
so the Mughals
Mm,
had ateliers, as we would call them, which is like uh, um, the British would call it like a factory, but we would call it an atelier, which is an infrastructure and a framework for artisans to come together and work in conjunction with each other. Uh, and someone would focus on one particular skill that they are good at, and another person would come in and employ themselves to add to it. And this was followed not just in architecture, for the painting from the Mughal school, the costumery, because again, just think about it this way: the Mughal imperial family itself, if you wanted to clothe them, you need a factory basically,
mm,
because you have to make sure that they have 3 or 4 pairs of clothes every day for every costume change. It's like a costume drama, right? And then have the highest quality fabrics.
mm.
And the amount of work required for it, you need dedicated teams to work on it. And there is an exquisite video, I think from the Met, the Metropolitan Museum in New York. They had a video about one Mughal costume that they managed to preserve, which shows how much detailed work goes into it. And this was not a costume of one of the emperors. This was a jama, I think, which is like the coat of one of the nobles, and not even one of the high-ranking nobles, but a medium-level
Mm.
noble, and the work that goes into it. And you realize how much they valued not just looking great, but also employing people to make you look great. It's like a industry within itself.
That kind of talks about how rich that empire must have been.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah. The Mughals, I think, again, reading history, you realize a lot of this is that the Mughal Empire at its height, depending on which period you consider to be its height, whether it be the reign of Akbar in the late 16th century, or Shah Jahan, when again construction, architecture, all of that was at height, or during the reign of Alamgir, more popularly known as Aurangzeb, when it was at its geographical highest extent.
mm,
The Mughal Empire was unquestionably the biggest state in the world in terms of economics. And by state, I mean in the modern sense, where if Republic of India is a state, the Mughal
mm,
state, extending from Afghanistan to Bengal to the Deccan, was economically the biggest, strongest, largest state in the world, which had just overshadowed the Qing, I think, in China. And it was some by some calculations about 10 times more than the entirety of Europe combined. That level of industry and economical success was possible because there was this one state controlling all these resources and uh, being able to use it so that somebody who's working in Lahore was able to communicate with somebody working in Daulatabad in the Deccan and exchange ideas and trade freely. Because imagine if the Mughal state of Hindustan is one country, then the right below it would be the state of Golconda, and just below it would be the Nayakas of Tamil Nadu, and then there'd be Malabar, which is another state. We think of it as India now because that's our historical reality. But in their time, these are different countries, just the same way as Pakistan is now a different country.
Mm.
Bangladesh is a different country, and crossing those borders are difficult, right? In the same way, in the medieval times, Hindustan, which constituted what would be from Afghanistan to Bangladesh, was a different country to what would be today's Tamil Nadu and Kerala,
Mm.
right? Again, these are historical realities that we don't really consciously think about. I think we might have to make this into a two-part episode now because I'm going on a tangent. Because think of it this way, to provide context for Indian history in particular. Again, William Dalrymple brilliantly puts this in context when he was talking about his new book, The Golden Road, which is that China, for most of its history, has been a united state, not the United States of China, but a united
Yeah,
state
yeah.
under one dynasty or a monarch for most of its history, with sporadic periods of disunity. India's history is the exact opposite. When we say India, we do not mean ever a single state. It is a geographical identity, just the same way as Europe is a geographical identity. But
Mm.
rarely has it ever been one United States. There was the Romans, there were the Merovingians, there were the Ottomans for a period of time in one part and then the others in the other, right? But it was never one state.
Mm.
Same with India. For most of India's history, from when the name was first used by the Greeks and then used by the Persians as Hindush or Hindustan by the
Mm.
18th century, throughout that period, it was never one unified state, all of it. And by India, I mean the sacred geography that is mentioned in the Vedas and the Hindu scriptures, which is all the way from the Indus to the Brahmaputra, Himalayas to the three seas. That's the sacred geography that we're familiar with when we say India.
Yeah.
But again, based on context, the meaning changes. To the Greeks, India was the area where Pakistan is now, which is the area near the Indus. That's it,
Mm.
right? Uh, but again, by the time the Arabs are here, India or Hindustan is North India. Everything else is not part of Hindustan. It's just part of the whole cosmopolis or the whole continental sphere of India. So I would really use the term India in the same way that I would use South Asia. It's a conglomerate of different independent states throughout history
Oh.
that had a similar religious, political, and civilizational idea, but rarely ever united under one state. And again, coming back to my book, the reason I positioned it in the way it is that I'm talking about the largest state that occupied the most significant position in India at any point of time, because all the other states positioned themselves in relation to that state, whichever that state is. For example, the earliest state in India to have hegemony over others is the state of Magadha. So around the 5th century BCE, when the Buddha and Jina Mahavira are emerging as philosophers and their sects are starting to gain power, the first true imperial state emerges in Magadha. Because before that, there was these small local states, like city states, about the size of districts today. So they then start to grow, expand under Ajada Shatru, who can be called the first real emperor in India. He started conquering all the neighboring states, and then he builds the first empire in India, but an empire of relatively small stature for India. It was still bigger than the entirety of the United Kingdom, but for India, it's a small state. a small empire, right? So from that, by the time of the Mauryas, who again did not call themselves the Maurya, they were still the state of Magadha, Ashoka of Magadha,
Mm.
right? That grows into what we consider to be the largest empire in Indian history, but again excludes most of the Deccan and South India. This is again a trend that will continue for the rest of Indian history.
Okay, I have a question.
Yes.
So the title of your book is The Lords of India, and the India that you have mentioned there is not the present day country India,
No.
and instead it is what you just spoke about, how
Yeah.
it is a geographical identity of
South
multiple
Asia.
nations
Yeah.
or kingdoms. Is it
Because,
right to call it
yeah,
kingdoms?
yeah, kingdoms. I use the term state because
Mhm.
it encompasses all kinds of polities. Because again, during the lifetime of the Buddha in the 5th century BCE, there were kingdoms like Magadha and Avanti and all these states, but there were also what are called Ganasanghas, which are republics in the Greek tradition, where you don't have a king per se, you have a group of royal or high class rich families, landowning families, and uh, they are the sangha who meet together and make decisions for the whole. So it's
Mm,
kind of a republic.
and they're independent from the other
Yeah,
neighboring states.
exactly. So
Okay.
think of Nepal. It's
Mm,
usually in that area because again, it's based on geography, right? If you're in an area like the Indus, Ganges, and Brahmaputra floodplains, which is rich in resources, and you have access to the riverine system, it's easier to control resources in the hands of one family or one
mm,
dynasty. But if you're towards the foothills of the Himalayas, you're cut off from the other people. So it's harder to put up a polity from one dynasty. And this is also true if you look at Greece. That's why they evolved the system they evolved, because you can't control land that you can't really access. So they evolved separate states like Athens. Each of those cities operated as a state in itself. Athens, Sparta, right? All of these different locations. But in most of India, if you control the riverine system, you can control the whole, which is
mm,
also true for Egypt. That's why they were always so much more stable, because if you control the river Nile, you can control the whole of the civilization there.
mm,
So that's why when I speak of India, it's not the modern Republic of India, which, again, for context, has only existed for what, about 80 years now, right? That's
mm,
it. That's one lifetime. That's less than the combined reigns of three Mughal emperors. If you just take Shah Jahan, Jahangir, and Aurangzeb, they lasted longer than India has, right? So when people say things like, oh, we were dominated by these families, they looted us and all that, they're not putting into context the realization that for the people who lived in those times, this family, for example, the Mughal family, has been in power for their state since the time of their grandfathers, their great grandfathers. That's their reality. Just the same way that for us, the Republic of India is the reality. It is hard for us to imagine a time when India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh were one unit,
mm.
especially for Malayalis, right? We were never part of any of the
Yeah.
states that were operated from North India. Not
Mm,
once in its entire history was most of Tamil Nadu and Kerala ever part of these states. But today, we are intrinsically part of India because it's a cultural whole, because
mm,
we think of it that way. But who knows what will happen in 100 years from now? We don't know. We think of now as reality. But again, as somebody who's known physics and science would know, there is no such thing as now. There is no such thing. Time is flexible. It's all a mirage. In 100 years from now, people will laugh at us saying, how did they think that this was going to last? Right? Because
mm,
even if you look at, forget the Mughals, think about the Cholas. They lasted like 400, 600 years. The imperial Cholas, just the imperial Cholas of Tanjavur and Gangaikonda Cholapuram. So
mm,
that's what I'm doing in this book. I'm trying to explain why some of the realities, what we think as unchanging, as always constant, as static, are not like that. Everything evolves over periods of time. And what history teaches us is that things will always change, and things that we take for granted will vanish in an instant. Just look at the United States. You thought democracy was a given, but we know now that if people are willing, capable, and able, and you allow them to, they will destabilize it and use it to turn it into an oligarchy. So,
Okay. I'm gonna lighten the conversation a little bit, like
okay.
lighten in the sense like intensity ways.
Yeah.
I'm pea-brained when it comes to history and stuff like that. So this is gonna be a very silly question.
I like
Um,
silly questions.
yeah. Which um ruler, um, non-gendered, oh my God, that is a whole different thing that I want to cover. Okay. Okay, which ruler was your favorite um in terms of prosperity, maybe,
Oh,
or the things that they have done, maybe, like culturally or something like that. Like
okay.
definitely Shah Jahan's Taj Mahal is definitely a milestone or something.
Yeah.
Like it's a big
Yeah.
thing, right? Like
Yeah.
creating Taj Mahal is not a small thing. He might be
Um,
shitty, I don't know because I don't know my history. Uh,
no, no,
but
no. The thing is, I don't personally ever choose my favorite based on any of the criteria that you just mentioned, like the prosperity and all that, because
okay.
we get history from the point of view of the upper classes in India. So what
Hmm.
we think of as prosperity for them might not have been so prosperous for the average person like we are. So because if we use the exact same criteria for today's history, we would think that we are in the most prosperous period in history because look at all the billionaires out there, right? So if we think about history in the same way,
Yeah.
right, the perspective changes. We know history from the perspectives of the rulers and the people who were able to put up these. Oh, it's giving me the warning. Um, they were able to put up these huge imarate, these buildings for their
Hmm.
glory. We only know about them. We get fairly, very rarely any glimpses into the life of ordinary people. So I
Hmm.
don't think about my favorite rulers in that way. But um, there are a few people who I am very interested in because of the policies that they enacted and what they did as rulers. One of them is Amokha Varsha, who was a Rashtrakuta ruler who was significant. He didn't conquer a lot of land like his sons and grandsons, and he did not build huge buildings like the Krishna the Third, who was, or Krishna the Second or Third, who built the huge Kailashanatha temple in Ellora, which is one of the grandest structures in the world. But he provided a stable framework upon which his dynasty could be built. His long reign, about 40 odd years, was filled with peace and prosperity, and he negotiated with the states around him to be able to build an empire that was stable and strong enough to make the Rashtrakuta Empire one of the pivotal, grandest, most exciting kingdoms in India's history. Because they were existing at a point of time when the direction of India's focus had shifted from Europe towards Southeast Asia. And
Hmm.
that this is discussed in detail in Anuruddh Kanisetti's book, The Lords of the Deccan, which is, I think, a fascinating read for anybody who wants to study Deccan history. But
Which,
I have one more
yes,
ruler to talk about, but I think I'll talk about it in the next part of this video because I don't want to run out of time. So I
fair.
would recommend if you have any questions, come up with them because this is getting juicy.
It is. It really is. Thank you so much,
No
Arjun.
problem. So we'll continue in part two.
Yes.